Hi, I'm Anna Cristina Cabrales, the tasting director of Wine Enthusiast magazine. Today we're exploring the tricky subject of tariffs. With Donald Trump set to take office in January, many wine industry folks are wondering what tariffs the president-elect might impose and how they could affect the industry. This time around, we have the benefit of experience, Trump's first term to guide our thinking. Is it all doom and gloom, or is there any hope on the horizon? We enlisted 3 experts to share their opinions. Bertrand Leulliette, a leading Burgundy expert and the founder and president of importer Bertrand's Wines, Michael Laudenslager, the general manager and wine director of New York City Italian restaurant Peasant, and Miguel de Leon, the wine director of New York City's Pinch Chinese. Here's what they think is going to happen and what steps they believe the wine industry should take. Bertrand, Miguel, Michael, so nice to have you on our podcast today. And I just want to rip the Band-Aid right off. Let's get into it. Let's paint the scene. And let's first talk about, especially before we really get into what's potentially to come, let's talk about what happened in 2019. A 25% tariff was placed on a range of agricultural products significant to Europe. And this was in retaliation against subsidies given to Airbus, the European aerospace company. Bertrand, let's start off with you. You're in the space of importing and selling one of the most prized regions in the world, Burgundy or Burgundy. Can you help our listeners understand how this affected you and your business?
Sure. So thanks for having me on the podcast today. So first of all, from the perspective of being an importer in the U.S., this was, I guess the word we can use is cataclysmic, in the sense that it essentially put the handbrake on the business. I don't need to tell you that Burgundy has become expensive over the past 5 years. It was already at a certain price point 5 years ago, obviously. And from one day to the next, for wines that cost $100 to become $130 or $135, because 25% increase in tariff does not increase the price by 25%, because every layer takes a certain percentage. So a 25% increase in tariff usually equates to a 35 to 40% increase at the end of the chain. So that was a huge blow for me personally, because my business was still in growth mode and I didn't have the ability to rely on retail sales, because my whole strategy when I started in the industry back in 2015 was to make sure that we had really affordable prices on Burgundy to have a place on wine lists. And so 90+% of our business was restaurants. And if you combine tariffs with the soon impending, COVID crisis, I can tell you that thinking back about those days is not something that brings warm memories. So, we're talking about, going from a business that was exploding then, or growing at a fast pace, to zero. I mean, we went from, growing at 25, 30% to not selling essentially a single case of wine over a year and a half. So that was personally what happened to me during the implementation of the tariffs by the government. And I'm happy to say that I survived it. So that is how I feel about what happened back then.
Passing this over to Michael and Miguel, you're both so impressive and I love your restaurants. Shameless plug, if you haven't been over to both Peasant and Pinch Chinese, make your way down there. They're so much fun. You definitely have to meet them both. Maybe we start with Miguel. I can only imagine, especially for your wine list, how this affected your restaurant, especially during the pandemic. Can you share your experience?
Yeah, the first time tariffs happened, I hate to say that's a qualifier that we have to add. But the first time the tariffs happened, right? I think everybody in the industry was thinking about it in an existential way. I remember all of us were glued to the TV because of two things. There was COVID happening kind of in
Mm-hmm.
China, and at the same time, these Lighthizer tariff interviews were happening with the U.S. Trade Organization. And I think everybody keyed in to people in our industry who weren't affected by coronavirus at that point. Yeah, I think it was just an existential thing of wine is going to get more expensive. We're going to have to eat this up for a little bit. And I think for the most part, distributors and distribution did that for us to keep us somewhat solvent and relevant for that entire period. So basically from 2019, about January 2019 until about, I would want to say 21, 22, until after that second wave of coronavirus. Wine was really hard to come by, one. Wine was really expensive, two. And three, the biggest thing that happened was that there was a big shift in how people consumed alcohol, partially driven by the pandemic and kind of like being stuck and bored indoors, or the understanding that alcohol as a social thing was something to be celebrated, but then compound that with the idea that also everything was more expensive, right? For the first little bit of it, I don't think restaurants really felt it all that much. I think distributors kept the tariff really, really reasonable. Even 25% looked like it was only really $2 on some bottles, right? But translating that for a guest, for example, that means that their ticket price goes up, what, $8, $10 maybe? So on top of inflation, I think the idea that tariffs are going to be another thing that people are going to get the buck passed on to is going to be something that's not going to be a very popular thing for consumers, let alone restaurant wine lists that have to make really specific, really tight margins already. I'm sure, Michael, you can think of the same thing at yours.
Yeah, Miguel, I think it's probably when we felt tariffs first, and I think you mentioned this. In the beginning, in restaurants, we really didn't feel tariffs right away because, again, you had COVID happen right away, right? And
Mhm.
everyone, I think, from home to restaurant did the same thing. They sat on what they had, liquor-wise and wine-wise. And then eventually, everyone started opening up everything they had at home,
Uh-huh.
right? And then restaurants started doing fire sales, right?
Mhm.
We'd say, I don't know what's going to happen, so let's go 50% off wine and this and that. And it kind of continued that way for quite some time. So when we got into the repurchasing and filling slots back, I think that was like the quick wake up call of what was really happening. That started in 2019, and I don't think restaurants truly felt it until around like mid 2020. Obviously, they weren't open up right away, but when we were ready to open and we did our fire sales and started cracking bottles and trigger fingering, corks out of the bottle, it was a rude awakening. And not just that, I mean, it was what was available. It was
Right.
something that was normal to purchase weekly or monthly. It was, "Oh, well, we don't have that right now."
Mhm.
And then you would rebound with something else, and then it would be the same story with that rebound wine or rebound bottle that you had. And next thing you know, you were just playing whatever I could get, you know? And then at the same time, you're dealing with the increase and you're trying to tell people, "Hey, this wine I'm not too sure with. This is what's available right now. Pinot Noir, I'm learning it with you,"
Mhm.
and then it's gonna be normal than what you've seen before. You know? I used to have this wine for $15 Pinot Noir slot, but now all my wines are 17 and $18. For a while, I kind of reacted that way, and I think a lot of New York or the world did with pricing and what was available. And now that we're seeing a new wave of tariffs, I've learned how to not combat them, but things that I saw work coming out of them, and I don't know if I'm jumping ahead here, and I know we were talking about the past, but like what I'm working on now in the present is seeing how I guess restaurants could react to them.
I do want to kind of touch on especially Italian wine. We keep hearing about French wines. Talk to me about what you saw, especially with buying like your regular wines like Prosecco or even Chianti. Like, talk to us about like what you saw on your end and what was available to you and what was not. Paint a picture for us.
Yeah, I mean, and here's the hard thing too. I mean, everyone knows in our side of the industry, there's mass producers and then there's like boutique producers or, small ones. I think some of the best restaurants and the glory and beauty in New York is we get like the access to these really beautiful small producers that
We're done.
we shed light on to the wine community. And they're the ones that probably run out quick. Not only that, I mean, you got to remember how wine gets to America, right? It's on ships and pallets. And if you don't have enough to fill a pallet, it's not coming over during tariffs, right? It's a crazy amount of tax already. And then if again with Chianti, I mean, how much Chianti is produced in Italy? When you start tapping into, the bigger producers, And then next thing you know, it almost turns into like allocated wine. And you're like, wait a second,
It's
this is
true.
insane. And it's very true. So, you know, it was shocking. I mean, that's really the only thing to say. Someone to tell you that you can't have a Chianti or, a Brunello that is always readily available, and they're telling you, "Yo, you gotta try with us next month. We're a little slim on that." And you're like, "Wait
Were
a
you
second,
ever
what?"
out of Prosecco?
Yeah, I it was an incredible the amount of Prosecco that I discovered just because I was like, "All right, who's got Prosecco?" It's like the Wild West for a second. And Prosecco, it's obviously just not poured by the glass, but you're using it in cocktails, right? So it's probably like the
Right.
number one wine you're pouring, so not knowingly, right? And you kind of learn that quick when things are light in inventory. So we just started bouncing. I started bouncing around to who's got Prosecco, and that was it. It didn't matter what kind you had. It was just like, all right, you got it. That's great. Send it over. And Prosecco prices, as we all know, should be at value, right?
Hmm.
Or at least should
Yeah.
be able to find value no matter what situation you're in. But again, when you want to talk about like availability of things, instead, if you're buying an $8 to $10 Prosecco all the time at your cost, at restaurant cost, at this time, we were looking for like 14, 15, and you're like, well, that's fine. It's going to get the job done at the moment. And later on, we'll try and find that $8 again. You just kind of went left and right for quite a while.
There's a couple wines that have, like, especially after the pandemic, especially after the first round of tariffs, there's a certain conscientiousness that came out of the EU that was like, people are looking for something that's easy to consume and easy to drink, and we've found a fair amount of those wines as well. Southern France,
Mm-hmm.
uh, the Northern Italy. There's a lot of these, like, what one would consider more classic or more traditional wine places, or I guess rather more productive wine places than most. And their wines tended to be the most audience friendly, both price and taste that came out of that. And so there's a certain sector that's really understanding what the American problem is. I think it's the question of the American problem, answering what the American problem is, because that's still the fact that I can get French wine into New York easier than I can get wine from California is
Yeah,
already a big problem. But we can
sure.
talk about the three-tier system some other podcast. That's another whole series. There's a unnecessary complication that, like, made us look to the outside, and that's why there was such a big, like, I think everyone was so happy. I'm sure the three of us were, when those tariffs got rescinded
Hmm.
and we were buying wine again in the quantities that we knew, in without the restrictions that we had understood, right? For a couple months there, I was looking at Riesling that was allocated, and I was like, when has ever this been like a problem? Never. Who
Right.
drink who cat who like, you know what I mean? But then also the understanding that, like, wine as an investment went out the window. And so the same thing, normally we would have regulars who would, like, drop money
Hmm.
to drink the wines that they wanted to drink, or maybe bring their own out of their own collections. But like Michael was saying, collection consumption shot through the roof because no one knew what to do with those wines. And I think because of that, the buying pattern for collection consumption has also gone way down. And so we're faced with a lot of these, like, consumption patterns super, super changing. And the fact that we're all, as a generation, just poorer
Hmm.
Yeah.
financially, means that the people that we would want to introduce these wines to, right? This next generation of Gen M, Gen Z, Gen Alpha, whatever you want to call them, they're also locked out of accessing these things in a joyful way.
Preach.
Just on the hedonism of it all, right? The Everyone was like, it the problem is Gen Z, the problem is millennials, the problem is Gen Alpha. It's like, the no, like, the audience never changed. You know what I mean? It's just that people found out that they could drink a seltzer with alcohol for cheaper and for less of a hangover, and there's also a weed alternative now, and there's also fewer places for people to gather as third places. So all of those kind of compounding together, like, it's not just the tariffs, but the tariffs are a really, really gnarly headstone on a pretty freshly dug grave.
I kind of want to know. Well, clearly you've touched on scarcity creating new opportunities. Has your wine list changed in spaces that you never considered before? And if so, can you quickly touch on that?
If you don't mind me jumping in, you know what it taught me, and I think this is the beauty of my list, and I think during these times they're ugly, but there's good things that happen. I think later, and what we learned from. We talked about how much you had to pivot on your list, and obviously everyone probably shrank your list during these tariff times, right?
Saw it all over the
Um,
place.
yeah, I mean everything became this like here's our 20 wines, and
Yeah, I went
hey,
from 350 to 88,
exactly, right. And I'm
Yeah.
just using like fictitious numbers here, but that was the scale everyone did. They went backwards. What it taught me is to change my wines all the time now. I am
Mm-hmm.
still in that repetition. I am still not like designing a list for the year. I'm designing a list now for the month,
Mm-hmm.
or the 2 weeks. And my by the glass is changing like I put on pants, it's like nonstop. And what I've learned, it keeps me fresh. Miguel mentioned it earlier that we reached to different areas of the world and we found beauty in these different areas, right?
We did something super, super similar at Pinch, I'll say. We It wasn't just a pivot of the magnitude that Michael was speaking about. We like reconceptualized our whole wine list from the tariffs. So we went from having an eclectic international by the glass selection to purely American winemaking in 2021, kind of as a response to the tariffs. Also, just to see kind of like what was out there really, right? We really wanted to do our homework and say, okay, well, if we're going to truly buy American, let's put our money where our mouth is and figure this out. And, we started bringing things on from, say, like Colorado, Maryland, Texas, Virginia, places that wouldn't normally have collected any sort of cachet on regular wine lists. But we were able to do that because of that pivot. And I think expressly because we were saying, if there's a way that we can spin this thing, it's a way for us to say, America's being great again or whatever. And it's like this is the way that we're gonna do that. Is that we're gonna highlight people who were doing it right, making it right, doing it something somewhat correctly for the people who are living on their land, etc. So I think that was like the biggest difference. The second was also, just like Michael was saying, really reaching into regions that normally wouldn't have any sort of like play or portfolios that you thought were tiny.
Give me one. Give me an example.
I never had as much Hungarian and Austrian wine
Cool.
than when I had, than the past 4 years. And I think those are really strong regions. First of all, especially in the space that we were occupying, which is mostly like biodynamics and natural winemaking. And so for me, it was really easy, really clear, I think, about how to have proceeded. But the ethics check or the morals check became like so much more important because it was really, if I'm going to spend this amount of money, I need it to matter.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I need it to mean something. And
Yeah.
that I think it's way more meaningful if I could say that, hey, we reinvested this into that California winemaker, or we were able to say, hey, we funded that Finger Lakes winemaker for a little bit. But it's also kind of like understanding that, well, they also had to buy their glass from overseas. They also had to get their cork machines from overseas. They also have migrant labor that they have to worry about. So again, tariffs is one layer of all of this policy making, but there's so many things that fall apart when this thing gets instituted because
Right.
we've been used to paying for only so much, not just for our wine, but also for our food and all those things.
Now I can see the wheels in Bertrand's head spinning. I know you
Yes.
want to say something. Go for it.
I mean, I'm listening to Miguel and Michael, and what I'm hearing is we got better at our job because of the tariffs.
Preach.
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, and I can tell you that what happened to me outside of focusing on premise is that from one day to the next, every single wholesaler around the US told me we're going to stop buying wine because we don't have visibility on our future. So you go from being a business that you have set high expectations, you have great vintages to sell, the portfolio was half the size it is today. I had like 10 producers I was supposed to kick off that year. I put a stop to that. I had to continue doing what I'm doing, which is I am in a bubble. I sell Burgundy. Everybody thinks Burgundy sells by itself, but I do not sell the Burgundy that most people think about when they think about Burgundy. I don't just sell Puligny and Chassagne and Meursault and Vaughan and Chambord, because the one way to make a name for yourself in a region like that is to actually go to the forgotten, go to the Peasant, go to the Vire-Classé, go to the Vézelay, go to Chitry, which are appellations that 99% of people would claim to know Burgundy I've never heard about. And they're like, what is that? I'm like, it is a white Burgundy. It is a red Burgundy. And to me, this is the big lesson from this. It's customers come in to a restaurant to eat and drink. You might not have the wine they're looking for, but guess what? You are providing the service that they came for. And I think we're spoiled in the industry we're in, because I don't think we realize how much power we have as far as shaping the future of what people do, what people drink, what people think, by just pouring that small amount of wine in their glass. And I often tell people, and I told this to AC a couple of weeks ago when we were in Burgundy, I said, if you're going to try a producer from an appellation that you have never been to, every brain works the same way. Your brain will create a little box that will put this appellation in there and say, okay, I am now entering data for appellation Chitry, and I just tried this producer called Edmond Charmeau, and this is now my reference point for this appellation. This is going to be the barometer for everything I try moving forward that may be coming from that village. And this is how your brain works. You can't deny that. That's the way it is. If I ask you, hey, what's your favorite, any appellation, the first thing that you're going to think about is either the best or the first one you add. It is the first thing that comes to your mind. And I can see your faces go, yes, yes. It's just the way our brain operates. And I think that for me, it made me better. It made me decide to go wholesale direct in New York City and to take a big gamble, pulled away from a big distributor, and to say, you know what, I will take my future in my own hands. And our business has doubled since then. And it's word of mouth. And, I've been doing this 10 years and finally have someone that's going to be working the market full time after 10 years of building the portfolio. And
Congrats.
all we
That's
do
great.
is it's just Burgundy and Beaujolais. So we don't have the leverage. We don't have the leverage of a champagne or a big co-op or a big, producer that will go into your restaurant and sell hundreds of cases a year. What we do is, if we're lucky, we'll get an order from you maybe once a month, because, that's how much wine we sell to a restaurant. But it forced me to be more resilient, to be more prepared. And I think it really brought back those core values that I established, which were like, focus, it's not about quantity, it's about quality. It doesn't matter whether people have heard of this or not. If it's good and it's in the bottle, it will work. And I think it is what I'm hearing from everybody here. It's like, people would try the wine. And I think Michael wants to say something about this.
Well, I had a question for you, Bertrand,
Mhm.
because talking to a lot of importers and the tariffs and what we're preparing for the next wave that is inevitable. I think it's already been mentioned. What exactly is going to be tariffed and taxed higher. But in the past, who ate those costs? Was it, and I know there's multiple stories here from portfolio to portfolio,
Right.
importer to importer, but what did you do? Did you end up eating the cost, or did you split it with other wineries? And do you have a plan going forward?
There was multiple ways to do it. So personally, I brought wine right before the tariffs were implemented. The few wines that I brought during the tariff, I was able to get my producers to eat half the tariffs, and I ate the other half. So I got, 12.5% discount, and, I reduced my cost by 12.5%. So we ate the 25%. And then I know that there was other ways to get around it, which was to put a virtual high alcohol, because as we know, anything over 14% was not tariffed. So you had, white Burgundies from cold vintages at 14%, which, I just said, I am a by the book kind of guy. So I didn't do any of that. So I would rather not buy anything that lose my import license, because this is more important.
I agree.
In addition to producing world-class content, did you know that Wine Enthusiast is also the premier shopping destination for wine lifestyle products? Just visit our shop at wineenthusiast.com, where you'll discover an amazing assortment of unique quality items guaranteed to enhance your wine experience. From glassware and accessories to thousands of unique wine gifts, it's like a toy store for wine lovers. And don't forget about protecting your wine. We are the nation's leading retailer of wine storage products. Whether you have 600 or 600 bottles, desire a wine cabinet or a custom-designed wine room, our free wine storage consultations will help you find the perfect wine fit for your collection. Visit wineenthusiast.com today. We bring wine to life. Brought to you by the Wine Enthusiast Shop.
Having some experience all over the place, but I loved before, especially in New York City, I felt like you could always kind of follow trends. You always knew what was coming, what would be hot, what would be next. Do you feel like that's just gone now and there's opportunity to create new ones, or do you feel like that's kind of impossible at this point?
Let's see. For me, it's segmented that specifically. I don't think it ever went away. I think when you're talking about trend chasing or looking at like what people are consuming, that it really breaks off because, like I said before, right, like how people consume has really, really changed. And so if you see, younger folks, they're not drinking as much. Their trends look more like a wellness chart. Or maybe something that follows something a little bit more like on the healthy side of things. Your collectors will always collect, although they're collecting less. But I think the interesting thing is like people our generation and over, so, your Gen Xers, etc. That's the kind of person who I'm very curious to know how their buying patterns are or their consumption patterns are. It's either they've been bullish and have kept it up the whole time, or they're the ones that are most adaptable to change, because it doesn't feel like on either side of that carpet that those consumption patterns have changed necessarily.
Bertrand, it looks like you want to add to that.
Let's take the example of Chianti earlier. You go to your little mom and pop's restaurant in your little town in the middle of Texas or Oklahoma or Kansas, and you're used to having your pizza with your wife and kids, and you have 2 glasses of Chianti. Well, it's no longer by the glass because it went up 30%. What are you going to drink? Well, you're not going to drink anything. You're going to drink a beer. You're going to drink a Peroni. Well, Peroni is going to get taxed too, maybe. So, or you drink a Corona. I don't think the Italian owner of your little pizza place is going to put Corona on the list. So, this is the thought process. Is there enough people that will associate California Zinfandel with a Primitivo and say, okay, I'm going to replace my Chianti with a Zinfandel from this producer that's going to pair with my pizza, which is a very traditional pizza. But guess what? They might say, hey, there's too much residual sugar in this wine. I'm not finding the same balance I'm finding in my imported wine. And so this becomes a whole different conversation. So when we're talking about earlier becoming better as buyers, right? Here we're talking about rewiring the brain completely to try to convince people that American wines can do the job of imports. And we all know it's not going to happen because restaurants are also a destination for that reason. People go shop and eat and drink at certain places because of the wine list that's on paper. And to me, this is the concern. And I think what I am trying to do and what we are trying to do is to communicate with the people that will be part of the next administration. But, the message is like, hey, if we can get enough of those mom and pops places to say, hey, this is how it's going to impact us. And this is not what we were sold. We were sold on, no prices going up, reduction of the inflation and this and that. And all of a sudden, my usual customers are going to stop coming because, wine went up and, they can't have their favorite wine with their pizza or, with their taco or whatever it may be. I think this is really the message we're trying to have, because I think the power of our industry, of the hospitality industry, is exactly that. Everybody has a favorite restaurant. Everybody has a place that they grew up going to eat at, that is part of the fabric of that neighborhood, of that city, of the history. And if you're going to, take that profit away from them, this might impact some of those restaurants like in a very bad way. We're talking about, losing staff, losing profit, because when you have a wine list that's both domestic and import, we know that the import are generating more revenue for most restaurants than the domestic wines.
Well, let's get into it then. Let's talk about the impending tariff. There's been mention in articles and other podcasts and whatnot, and I'd like for you to expand on how the tariff will actually affect U.S. wines. How will it become more expensive? I feel like people are not understanding this.
Yeah, the first thing that I'll tell you, and I think, Michael, you can back me up on this, is that our pricing on By the Glass, especially in Manhattan, looks astronomical. Like, my most expensive glasses look like our bottle prices from 5-6 years ago.
Agreed. Yep.
That's
Yeah.
significant, right? That's significant in terms of how you tell people you should be drinking this, and on a day-to-day basis, on an everyday basis, like for someone to have to fork over $20+ for a glass of wine feels immoral to me. But then again, if there has to be some sort of balance about what I'm providing, what the producers are making, what's available to me, and how that's being charged. Because I still need to think of all of those things and be hospitable and give you something that's affordable and give you an experience that you're going to want to come back to.
Sure.
Right. So all of those things, I think the biggest thing that you're going to see is just your everyday wine consumption is going to be more expensive and going to be a lot restrictive in terms of like the artistry or maybe even like the personal touch that you can put on a By the Glass or a By the Bottle list.
I feel the same way. If I'm going out and I want a glass of wine, I'm not drinking, 3-4 glasses of $20 wine, I'm going out and I'm looking for the best bang for my buck. If there's a little vintage on it, wahoo, and so on. And we have to adjust too for the consumer. Just like our importers adjusted for us, it's our job to do it for the consumer, or else people are not going to drink wine. And we want them to drink good wine, right? Wine enthusiasts isn't about bad wine. We're talking about good wine and good practice and what we want to happen here. So I think it's up to us on the restaurant side is to also follow suit and absorb a little bit and get a little bit more creative, So, and even if you love a wine, and this happens to me because I have weird wines on my list and I just want it to be drank. If you love a wine, then knock it down. Who cares? Go 35% cost on that wine, My bosses are going to listen to this later and go, Mike, we're going to have a talk. But I'm going to be strong. I'm going to stand strong on this. But, I really believe that if you want something to be sold, then you have to have it, priced correctly. You have to have it attractive. You really do. But I think this time around, at the end of the day, we are all better than what we were going into it in 2019. And it sounds like we have some pretty good ideas or some good rebounds.
And so the next question is, American wines will suffer from this. They will go up in price. And I can tell you that my first boss, when I started in the industry 20+ years ago, used to tell me, a happy truck is a full truck. And so when a distributor does a delivery to a grocery store that has on average 1,200 SKUs, and I would say probably 80% American wines on the shelves, or 70% American wines, that truck is full of wine. And the other wines are the Proseccos and the Cavas and, whatever big brands go into those grocery stores. When those same rounds are being done for on-premise deliveries, it's the opposite. It's a truck that has 30% American wines and 70% imported wines. And in New York City, it might be 10% domestic wine and 90% imported wines. So all of a sudden, that cost of delivery, if you don't have the imported wines on there, it's going to jack up big time, because it's going to be like, hey, we're delivering 90% empty truck here, and we cannot pay for that, because I can tell you that a delivery for me in New York City is costing me about $50. Whether I deliver 1 case or 6 cases, it's $50. And so this is a cost. So imagine for all those big companies, they're going to say, no, we can't pay for that. We can't swallow that cost. And so that's going to make domestic wines more expensive, in my opinion, going on premise. And I think at retail, if they're going to lose money on the import, they're going to have to balance their revenue. They're going to have to increase the price of domestic wines in order to make things work. So that's how I think it's going to impact domestic wines personally.
So what's the strategy for all three of you now walking into this? Clearly you have all survived and have become resilient, but what are you thinking now?
I've been aggressive on buying. I don't think I've been, you know, crazy aggressive, like buying anything I want here, like I'm Rockefeller, but I am definitely being more thoughtful and looking more towards future than months.
So I'll talk to you about the approaches that I've been working on all the sites that I work at, because the approach for wine is all different from all of them, right? So for Strange Delight, for example, tiny list, right? A dozen wines, maybe 8 of them by the glass, all American. The way that we structured that list was to make it feel as neighborhood as possible. The idea that a $9 glass still fits within this current climate was a really big deal for us. And so we were looking at budget friendly, and again, especially American winemaking for a lot of that. The biggest shift is on the other 2 properties, so at Pinch and at the Wine Bar Project. Pinch used to white label a bunch of things through different distribution points, different producers, etc. I'm not necessarily telling you to drink Oregon for France, not my business, but I can at least kind of say these things can maybe come close in terms of what your expectations of those things are. They're at a reasonable price point. And I think highlighting why it's expensive in the way that it is, right? Americans still have a big chip on their shoulder about stuff that's made here, and especially wine, and especially things like in states that are not renowned for having such, But I think a little bit of gentle education goes a long way for a lot of folks, especially in programming like that. The best thing that I can do is to kind of stick to my guns in terms of my programming, my philosophies, and like how I speak to my staff about how we talk about wine culturally in our space so that it still feels ingrained in every day and like, low barrier to entry, easy to access. But at the same time, it's like, if I'm telling you that, and I think I'll go back to the wine class example for this, is that imagine a level 1 student going through wine education currently, right? Their first instances are almost always going to be Bordeaux, Burgundy, and can they afford those wines actually currently, right? And so if you think
Probably
about
not.
but if you think about the current American student, that's always the situation.
Yeah.
But can we even say the same for them about American wine? And I don't think so either. I think we've done the American consumer such a disservice by placing it in such an expensive place,
Mm-hmm.
and then also not being so untransparent about why those prices are the way that they are, right? And so, yes, we can talk about pallets and we can talk about shipping, but like, have we even talked about how gasoline prices affect California winemaking
Mm-hmm.
and how
Yeah.
refrigerated trucking has to be a thing, and all these other things that we aren't really that are going to be affected. Again, they're going to be affected by the tariffs, but because the system is set up in a way that where it has to be so fragile and there's only so many actors that can really change that policy. I think it's about time that we start thinking about it as a group of people, as people who are being affected by this policy, to maybe even change it or be the people to lead that kind of conversation. I hope conversations like this can continue to happen, because it's like, if tariffs are existential and they can happen every other presidential cycle, like, what's to say that the health of the industry is somewhere that is like deeper and more deeply financially solvent, rather.
I think with all my buddies that sell and concentrate and are specialists on American wine in California, not just California, American wine, it's really hard for them. It's really hard to get Americans to start drinking American wine, and it's probably because we bastardized it in a sense for a while, just like the Languedoc went through jug wine. We went through oaky, over extracted, add sugar wine for a very long time. And now we're not doing that, but it's like crying wolf, it's like, please try our wine right now, and try it during these hard times because French is too high. So try it right now.
So, jumping on that, Bertrand, how do you make the growing price of Burgundy sexy?
My first answer is, okay, I'm looking at this person, define expensive. Okay, because for some people, expensive, when you're talking about Burgundy, you're talking about 10 grand. Some people
Sure.
are talking about $500. And the person who's never had Burgundy is talking $50. So you need to know your audience, right? So there are absolutely, in our portfolio, I can tell you that there's over 40% of our portfolio can be on a wine list for under $100. And we're talking about estate Burgundy from
That's
30
beautiful.
plus families. Remember 10 years ago when all the deal was to have Côte de Provence and that's all you could sell? Now, you go to any restaurant in New York City, you'll have people walk in the summer and say, I'll just get a glass of rosé. They don't say, I want a glass of Provence. They're being poured a glass of rosé. They don't
Or
care.
they say chilled red wine.
Or
Yeah.
chilled red wine, absolutely. And so I am
Funky orange.
a believer that if I can achieve this by the time I retire, where people will just walk into a restaurant and say, I will have a white Burgundy from your, section of BTG or whatever, doesn't matter what it is. All they care is that it's estate produced and, it's an appellation that is or not on their radar. What would you suggest for white Burgundy? And you can absolutely today get estate white Burgundy at $20 or less BTG. And they're available. They exist. We have them. And the people that do buy from us are moving a ton of them, but it's word of mouth. But I just think that we're close to needing to wrapping this up, but I just want to say that if I compile everything we've said, I think we can all agree that we've gotten better at our job because of what happened 5 years ago. I think we're more prepared, we're more resilient. And I will tell you what I've been telling my producers for the past 2 weeks I was in Burgundy, were honestly scared. I told them, listen, we don't know what's going to happen, but if you choose to wake up every day telling yourself, I'm going to get hit across the face with a baseball bat, I just don't know when, that's not a way to live your life. So I told them, just trust that we are going to be as prepared as possible in order to respond to something if it does happen. And that's the only logical response you can give them. You can't tell them, oh yeah, we're gonna get so destroyed. I mean, it's gonna be horrible. That's not a way to live your life, I think. So we just have to be optimistic and upbeat, because if I'm not upbeat about what's gonna happen here, how are they supposed to be upbeat about their own future? That's our job as the hospitality industry, to be the invisible hand. I often tell people when they go to a restaurant, I said, we're the invisible hand that makes sure that you have a great time without even realizing that somebody picked up your plate, cleaned your table, poured you a glass of wine, then a second glass of wine, and all you got to do was pay the check and you had a fantastic experience. And this is the job of the hospitality industry. You go there to disconnect. You sit there, you have a great time, you walk out. And for that moment of time you were in that restaurant, you forgot about your problems. This is our job. And I think this is my job also as an importer, is to find that wine that will make that experience for Miguel, Michael, whoever works on premise, to facilitate that and to sell that experience of, you're in our little bubble here for the amount of time you're going to be here. And that's also what we're trying to tell everybody that is going to be involved in the future government. Hey, this is what we sell. And if you're going to raise prices, we might not be able to sell that to a lot of people. We're selling a dream of, this is Disney for like 2 hours of your meal. It's like, it's a wonderful world. You're going to have a good time, good meal, good food. Everybody's going to be nice and polite. And when you walk back out, well, you're back into your real life.
Well put, Bertrand, and I'm so glad that you kind of helped me wrap up here. I'm sure we could probably sit here for another hour or three together, especially if we had a bottle of wine and really go at it. Maybe there is a part 2 to this, especially early next year, but I don't want to close this up without your thoughts, Miguel and Michael, so go for it.
My final thoughts are, what I see is going to happen is tequila is going to absolutely rise. People that distribute are going to find ways to spread the increased dollar amount on product around the portfolio. I think, it's going to be hard for certain categories, and I think we're a little bit better prepared, and we're probably going to be coming out stronger than we did out of 2021, 22. And I'm kind of not excited, because nobody wants to see increase in pricings, but since it's inevitable, I'm anxious to see what happens.
Yeah, I'm optimistic. I'm optimistic about the future, I think.
Mm.
With how we can, just like Bertrand was saying earlier, how we can affect the general psyche of the audience, especially when it's us who are, curating or maybe telling these experiences that are worthy or whatever else. I think it's up to us to make sure that American wine is part of that conversation. I think it's up to us to make sure that price is at front of mind for that conversation. I think understanding like what the need of the other person is, right, is going to be so key on how we survive this thing. But the most important thing, I think, is understanding why your stuff costs the way that it does. If you don't know, find out, please.
Yep.
And it makes such a big difference on how you perceive your everyday consumption and why your dollar, I think, matters so much more when it gets fed back into a system that really gives back to the people that produce that thing. So whether or not that's American winemaking or vegetable production in the middle of the country, like we need to be really understanding about how, when those goods move, that the effect on us as the people who are consuming them, like that's a way more impactful than what you're thinking.
Guys, I really love how your energy is around this topic. It's not easy to grapple with. Everything out there pretty much looks like doom and gloom, but this really goes to show how good you guys are at what you do, how great you are at what you do. So I can't thank you enough. I think we do need a round two, probably. But thank you guys
I'm
so
in.
much for being here. And if there's anything else we could touch on later on, feel free to add it to your socials, or we'll probably just talk about it later on. But thank you so much.
No problem.
Amazing.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you, everyone.
What do you think is on the horizon for the wine industry in light of the impending tariffs? We want to hear your thoughts. Email us at podcast@wineenthusiast.com, and we might share your feedback on the podcast. We love hearing from you and appreciate your support. Please rate and review us whenever you listen to podcasts. Remember to visit us at wineenthusiast.com for content and products that bring your love of wine to life.